There's over 20,000 species. They cover 7 to 8% of the surface of the earth. And if that's not cool enough, Egyptians used to stuff their mummies with them. Today we're on the Trail of Lichens. So what is a lichen? Lichens are symbiotic relationships between a fungus and a blue-green algae. They're long-lived, they grow really slow, and they can exist in exceedingly harsh environments. We're talking way up above the Arctic Circle where really nothing else can survive. These are amazing, amazing little organisms. They're literally a microcosm unto themselves. They are a microhabitat in the sense of they have both a fungal component called the mycobiont and they have a photosynthetic component called the photobiont. Now, it was believed and has been taught for like 150 something years that these things are a fungus with a blue-green algae or a fungus with a green algae. Recent studies have shown, however, that it might be two different types of fungus with a blue-green algae, or maybe a fungus with a green and a blue-green algae. All these different combinations, they're literally little universes in themselves. If you don't know what I mean by a little universe, go watch my video on microhabitats and it will show it to you. Each of the partners in this symbiotic relationship has a specific job. The photobiont, the algae, their job is to photosynthesize and produce food for the lichen. The mycobiont, the fungus, their job is to provide a structure, anchor that lichen to something, and soak up water so there's plenty of water for the photosynthetic process. When both of them are functioning together, they serve one another in that mutually beneficial way. So the whole body of a lichen is called the thallus. That's the nerd term for the whole leafy structure, the entire body of a specific lichen. Those thalli, plural, come in three basic body shapes. You've got crusty, leafy, and bushy. Crusty, leafy, and bushy. Now, we can't just call them crusty, leafy, and bushy because that doesn't nearly sound nerdy enough. We have to come up with bigger words so that we sound smart. So let's call them instead by their nerd terms, their nerd words. Crustos, Phallus, and Fruticos. Yes, much more intelligent sounding. Crustos, Phallus, Fruticos. What are the differences in these body types? I'll show you. Lichen anatomy is fairly simple. You've got two basic layers. You've got a cortex, which is composed of tightly woven hyphae. Hyphae are fibers, strands of fungi. And then you have what's called the medulla. The medulla is kind of a more open part where the photosynthetic layer is. That's where all the algae and blue-green algae are going to hang out. That's really it. Now, take those and arrange them in different ways and you create the different types of lichen. So in a crustos lichen, the tortilla represents the cortex and the peanut butter represents the photobiotic layer. So you get that. There's only an upper cortex and the photosynthetic layer, and it grows just like that, almost like someone spray painted right onto the side of a tree or a side of a rock or a side of a building or whatever. And that's literally what it is. If you try to remove this because there's no lower cortex, you try to remove this and then, ooh, you just end up with all this junk and you destroy the lichen. Yeah, destroyed. So, what about the other lichens? Well, let me get some more peanut butter. If you have a foliose lichen, you have the photosynthetic layer, and you have that cortex, but then you have not just the upper cortex, But then you have a lower cortex. Now when this sits on a tree or a rock or something else, you've got a lower side. It has rhizines that are growing out, anchoring this thing into the tree or rock or tombstone or building or whatever it's growing on, and it anchors it. But that's why it's leafy, it's foliose, because literally you can lift up the edges of it, you can look underneath it, you can pull this off, and you really don't damage the thing at all because it has the two layers. So what about the third type? Well, the third type, that would be the Fruticos. The Fruticos lichen is simply this. You've got that photosynthetic layer, just like that, only this time the cortex wraps around it so that you've got cortex all the way around and you have all the photosynthetic stuff on the inside. So, well, that's the Fruticos. And it's delicious. So here's an actual example of a Crustos lichen. You can see it right here. It's like a paint swatch. It's just spray painted on the tree. Remember, only the upper cortex, there is no lower cortex, so it's completely attached to the bark of this tree. There is no pulling that off without destroying the lichen. I want to make notice the little round structures on there. Pay attention to those. I'm going to talk about them in just a second. In the foliose, you see the same thing. You see lots and lots of leafy. This has the upper and lower cortex, which allows it to be leafy, come up off the branch, and be able to have that kind of a lettuce-looking structure. Notice these little brown cups right there. Those are important too. And with the Fruticos, notice now we have a tall, three-dimensional branching type of structure. It comes up, it branches again, it branches again. So these structures right here are called the apothecia. The apothecia is literally the fruiting body of the fungus itself. It's just like a mushroom growing out of your yard. It pops up and it drops spores. The interesting thing is once these spores begin to spread, they can potentially begin to grow another fungus. But they're not going to do it until they come into association with either the green algae or blue-green algae that are necessary to make this particular type of lichen. How that fungus finds that algae or blue-green algae, we have no idea. That's still a mystery. Now, these aren't the only ways. That's just the sexual way that these lichens can reproduce. So lichens can not only reproduce sexually by use of the apothecia, but they can also produce asexually. That is, they're not going to get any kind of new combinations of DNA. One of the ways they can do this is simply by what's called vegetative reproduction. Vegetative means that you get a piece of this lichen, like that one. Oh no, it broke off because of a storm or something. And now that lichen, whoop, gets blown over there. And if it's a suitable area, it will simply continue to grow. All right, that is vegetative. There's also other structures. There are ceridia, which are like little tiny packets of blue-green algae or the green algae, little packets of those photosynthetic organisms that are wrapped up in hyphae, and those get thrown out in little structures called cerealia. That's little dust, like it looks like little dusty patches on these lichens, and those get blown off by the wind or hit by the rain, and if they find a suitable area, they can also begin to grow where they are. And then you also have the Isidia, and you have the Pycnidia, and all these other kinds of crazy sounding things. But they're all, the purpose of them is all to reproduce the lichen asexually. That is no exchange of DNA. One DNA is the same as the other. It's almost like budding off and making a twin. Kind of cool. Oftentimes we find lichens growing on trees, but they are not parasitic. They're not causing any harm to the tree at all. As a matter of fact, they're only using the tree as a convenient spot to land so they can get plenty of sunlight to grow. I can prove that they're not parasitic. Here's a lichen growing on a rock. You can't parasitize a rock. It's not alive. Not all lichens grow on trees. Here's a Fruticos lichen, grows on the ground. This is called reindeer moss or deer moss, but it's not a moss, it's a Fruticos lichen. So lichens, what's there not to like? They're colorful, they're everywhere. Some are edible, some are used for medicine, some were used to stuff inside. They actually found them stuffed inside of the mummies of the ancient Egyptians. They're just awesome little organisms. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to press the liken button right down below. I'm Gregg Thompson. I'll see you on the trail.